I met up with an old college friend, let's just call him David, at a coffee shop last week. And he looked like a ghost of his former self. His eyes were sunken, and he was, nervously tapping a pen against the table.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. David was always the guy who did everything right. He just followed the script to the letter. He got the engineering degree, the six-figure salary, the house in the suburbs, the joint bank accounts. He was the ultimate provider, the safe bet.
The whole package, as they say.
Exactly. And he spent a whole hour walking me through the wreckage of his marriage. But he sounded less like a heartbroken husband and more like a confused accountant auditing a failed business.
That's a powerful image.
It's true. He was listing his contributions like line items. He said, I paid off her student loans, I handled the mortgage, I even did the laundry on weekends so she could relax. And he kept asking, with this genuine painful bewilderment, I kept my end of the deal, I provided everything. Why did she leave me for a guy who can barely hold down a part-time job?
He saw it as a breach of contract.
A complete breach of contract. He believed that if he input security and resources, the machine was supposed to output loyalty and desire. But as I listened to him just spiral, I realized this terrifying truth that he couldn't see.
Which is what?
David wasn't a victim of bad luck. He was a victim of obsolescence. He was trying to buy genuine desire with a currency that has suffered, catastrophic hyperinflation. He didn't realize that the provider contract he built his entire life around had been quietly canceled decades ago, rendered null and void by a competitor he never even saw coming, the state.
And that story, David's story, his confusion, it really cuts right to the heart of what we're going to be analyzing today.
It really does. The central mystery here is this. Why doesn't that traditional currency of security and resources, what a lot of online communities call beta bucks, why doesn't it guarantee loyalty and desire in modern relationships anymore? David's experience. It feels like a consequence, not a cause, of these huge structural shifts.
It absolutely is. And our mission in this deep dive is to investigate exactly how that provider contract became obsolete. We've synthesized sources that address really three distinct but interwoven seismic shifts.
Okay, what are they?
So first, you have the legal and economic changes, the ones that position the state as the ultimate non-negotiable provider of security. Second, there are the biological and evolutionary mechanisms, often summarized by something called Briffault's law, which dictates how female mate choice shifts when that resource scarcity is lifted.
And the third?
And third is the social crisis that these changes created. It's what fostered this reactive counter-ideology that we now know as the Manosphere or the red pill.
So let's start with that foundational shift, the legal and economic architecture. We really need to understand how these comprehensive social welfare systems and, evolving family laws in developed nations have reshaped that traditional male provider role, how they fundamentally decoupled provision from desire.
To really appreciate the collapse, you have to first understand the stability of the old contract. Historically, the male provider role created this transactional equilibrium.
Kind of trade-off.
A trade-off, exactly. The man provided resources and physical security, and in exchange, he receives loyalty, sexual access, and partnership. And this wasn't just, a cultural preference. For countless generations, those resources were the only reliable path to a woman's survival and successful reproductive output, especially given the huge biological investment of pregnancy and childbearing.
So that model had tremendous transactional leverage. If a woman decided to leave, the economic consequences could be, catastrophic for her and for her children.
Absolutely. The moment that existential necessity disappears, the transactional leverage of the average man it evaporates. David's operating system, the one that says, I input money and I get a guaranteed relationship in return, is running on a completely obsolete playbook because that underlying necessity is gone.
And the most profound change to that system had to be the legal one, right?
Without a doubt. The most profound, immediate, and structural change was the widespread legal adoption of unilateral or no-fault divorce laws across the Western world. When we look at the United States, for instance, almost every single state now permits some form of it, and critically, roughly 2/3 allow it to be completely unrestricted.
So the removal of fault, meaning you didn't have to prove infidelity or abuse or abandonment, that must have completely upended the bargaining dynamics in a marriage.
It was a total game changer. The legal structure before that, it incentivized, or at the very least it mandated, better behavior. Or, it assigned a legal and financial penalty if you didn't behave. You could lose property, you could lose standing. Right. Unilateral divorce completely decouples that resource exchange from the behavior that was required under the old contract. Security is no longer a negotiated benefit that's contingent on your loyalty or your performance. It becomes a legal mandate that's enforceable by the government. The ability for either partner to just walk away, the exit option, it became dramatically easier and far less financially perilous for the non-earning or the lower-earning spouse.
So if the exit option is now subsidized by the state, the value of staying in a relationship goes down, doesn't it? Especially if the relationship is just stable, but maybe not all that fulfilling.
Exactly. And this leads us right to that anecdote we found about Thomas, the structural engineer. His realization is the absolute epitome of this structural replacement.
Tell us about that. His story really crystallizes this idea.
Thomas's story is so visceral because it connects that abstract legal shift to a person's identity. He had spent 2 decades believing his 6-figure paycheck, his mortgage, his life insurance, that all of that was the non-negotiable foundation of his family.
As most men in his position would.
Of course. But when his marriage ended, he was confronted with the immediate and systematic involvement of the state's mechanisms. Family courts, robust child support enforcement, alimony requirements, all of it designed to manage that resource transfer.
He wasn't the provider anymore. He was just the funnel for the money.
Precisely. His profound identity crisis came from the realization that he wasn't the head of the household in any traditional sense. He was a tax source for government redistribution to his ex-wife.
Wow.
He recognized the state as the ultimate competitor in resource provision. He called it the surrogate husband. It provided the security his wife needed without requiring his presence or his loyalty or his affection. His unique contribution became a commodity that the state could just acquire and redistribute through legal force.
And if the government is guaranteeing the floor, that baseline of survival needs, whether it's through welfare or housing or court-enforced support, it systematically removes that existential pressure from the mating equation.
That's the mechanism.
And that's how the resources offered by the average guy like David suffer that catastrophic hyperinflation we mentioned at the start.
Think about it in basic economic terms. If stability and security are scarce goods, a man offering a $100,000 income, a house, reliability, he's offering a high-value item, a very high-value item.
Right, it's a premium product.
But if the state provides a baseline safety net, enough legal and social support to ensure survival and shelter, that man is essentially trying to sell a commodity that is now abundantly available elsewhere, even if it's at a slightly lower quality. The difference between survival and affluence is still large, but the difference between starvation and survival has been removed, and that makes the former provider's currency dramatically less compelling.
Okay, but we absolutely have to provide some context here, because suggesting the state makes the provider obsolete, that can really oversimplify the harsh realities for people, can it?
Oh, absolutely. That nuance is essential for a balanced view. While the state does act as a backstop, this system doesn't translate to immediate economic security or, affluence for those who leave a marriage.
Never at all.
Despite all the systemic support and enforcement mechanisms, single mothers still face disproportionately high economic insecurity. The data consistently shows high poverty rates and much lower incomes compared to single fathers or married parents.
Yeah.
The state removes the existential threat, but it doesn't solve the underlying structural economic disadvantages.
So the safety net is critical for survival and for agency, for the ability to leave. But it's not a path to economic comfort by any stretch. It removes the necessity of staying in, say, a bad or unfulfilling relationship, but that struggle for financial stability remains incredibly sharp, and it primarily falls on the mother.
And you see this reflected in policy. The policy response in many developed nations focuses on strengthening that safety net things, like expanding the child tax credit, raising the minimum wage, pushing for universal paid leave, and ensuring accessible childcare. The focus isn't on promoting marriage as the primary economic solution anymore.
Because the data shows that marriage itself doesn't guarantee economic security for many people, and family structures are just more fluid now. They require that external support.
Exactly. And the employment data reflects this ongoing burden. Single mothers generally have very high employment rates. They're active in the labor force, but a significant percentage, something like 18%, are working part-time.
And that's much higher than for fathers.
Well, it contrasts sharply with married fathers, where only about 4% work part-time. And that difference is almost always directly attributable to disruptive factors, like the lack of affordable, reliable childcare.
So, to sum up this first part, the average man's resources become obsolete, not because women are suddenly rich.
Not at all. It's because the pressure for survival provision has been successfully socialized. The cost of leaving, which was the ultimate bargaining chip of the provider, has been significantly reduced. And this detachment of the provider role from existential necessity, it sets the stage perfectly for our next shift, the purely biological layer of human mate choice.
Right. So we're transitioning now from these observable systems of law and economics to the deeper, more ancient, the driving algorithms of human nature. This is where we investigate the evolutionary psychological mechanisms, the principles that explain why, in affluent societies, female mate choice increasingly prioritizes things like genetic fitness and emotional value over that traditional resource provision, a shift often summarized by Briffault's law.
This is the exact point where the resource devaluation we just talked about collides head-on with biological reality. When the environment changes, the optimal mating strategy has to change with it. And these ancient mechanisms that were suppressed by necessity for so long suddenly get unleashed.
So let's unpack Briffault's law itself. I know it originated as a premise applied to non-human animals, and its logic is, well, it's cold and clear.
It is. The core idea is that the female determines all conditions of the family and, crucially, past male benefits, any past provision, any past protection, are completely irrelevant to the present situation.
The brutal, cold logic of a biological algorithm.
Completely. It's optimized purely for the survival and successful reproductive output of the offspring. In nature, a female animal has essentially zero incentive to maintain a relationship if the male ceases to provide a current tangible benefit.
Why is that?
Because resources are finite, time is short, and survival is absolutely paramount. There's no room for sentimentality in that equation.
So we're talking about an evolutionary failover mechanism. If the provider male fails, maybe he loses his job, gets injured, or just has a decline in status, the female's optimal non-conscious strategy is to shift her mating calculus to protect the future of her offspring.
Precisely. Things like gratitude, loyalty, past sacrifice. Those are social and emotional constructs. Mate selection, at its absolute base, is a primal instinct. Your past investments are reduced to zero. What matters is the value you deliver today.
Current protection, current resources.
They're crucially current genetic and social fitness. And this reality, this cold logic, it perfectly explains the painful experience of Julian, the fintech manager.
Right. Julian's story is a textbook example of this shift in action. He acted as the perfect beta provider. He invested heavily in his partner's long-term structural security.
He paid off her substantial student debts. He funded her master's degree. He basically allowed her to reach financial independence on his dime. He believed this massive, long-term resource investment guaranteed her loyalty and her desire.
A classic provider contract mindset.
The classic mindset. But once those financial constraints were lifted, once the resource equation was solved by his money, her dependence on him ended. And almost immediately, her desire diminished. And she left him for a man who was less financially resourceful, but offered what she saw as emotional volatility and genuine, non-negotiable desire.
So Julian secured what we might call negotiated desire. It was bought through gratitude or comfort or maybe even obligation.
But that's functionally fragile, isn't it? It crumbles the moment the gratitude is paid off or the obligation is lifted. He completely failed to secure that genuine biological desire that's tied to status, excitement, and perceived genetic fitness.
And this is the direct consequence of resource scarcity being lifted, combined with the state acting as that ultimate safety net. In affluent, secure societies, the constraint on female hypergamy is effectively removed.
Yes, hypergamy, that drive to seek the best available mate, the best genes, or the highest status, is essentially unleashed. If your survival is guaranteed, your mate choice shifts away from that purely transactional question of who can reliably feed me.
And it moves towards the more biological and emotional question of who excites me, who offers the best genetics or the highest status.
The purchasing power of resources declines because they're abundant, or at the very least they're subsidized. And conversely, the currency of raw attraction, things like genetic fitness, charisma, genuine status, non-financial excitement, that skyrockets in value because those things are inherently scarce and they cannot be subsidized by the government.
Now, this evolutionary logic has been studied extensively in academia, but it's also been, let's say, co-opted and interpreted by these online communities.
Very much so.
They take concepts like the dual mating strategy and they simplify it into things like the alpha fucks beta bucks principle or AFBB.
Right. The Manosphere communities appropriate these concepts directly from evolutionary psychology to argue that women operate on this calculated dualistic mating strategy. They suggest women seek out the alpha male, the genetically superior, high status, often risk-taking male for, sperm donation and superior genes.
And then they seek the beta male, the dependable beta money dispenser, for long-term economic and emotional provision.
It's a very cynical interpretation, for sure, but it uses the language of evolutionary logic. The idea is you marry the stable partner for security while seeking out the attractive high-status partner for superior genetics. You're effectively trying to maximize both provision and genetic quality.
It's presented as a kind of optimal, if ruthless, strategy.
One of the central tenets you'll find in their online guides suggested that a man's provisioning potential is what motivates pairing with the good dad type. But those very characteristics, stability, caution, patience, are often the opposite of the qualities that exemplify raw genetic and physical attraction, which can include higher risk-taking and physical prowess. In a safe society, the genetic benefit starts to outweigh the provision benefit because provision is abundant.
But this shouldn't suggest that resources become totally irrelevant, right? It just means their priority changes relative to all the other factors.
Absolutely. That's a key distinction. And the evidence confirms this. In countries with robust social safety nets and high female financial independence, women consistently downgrade the importance of a partner's financial prospects compared to women in developing nations or societies with less security.
So the preference shifts dramatically toward interpersonal traits once that economic floor is met.
Precisely. Women begin prioritizing traits that ensure a satisfying and cooperative long-term relationship. Things like emotional stability, a good sense of humor, kindness. This is especially true for educated couples who are separated from wider supportive kin networks, where the quality of the marital partnership itself has to carry the bulk of the social and emotional load.
That makes perfect sense. If you don't have extended family nearby, the internal quality of your relationship is paramount for your psychological well-being, even if it doesn't solve your mortgage. The need for a good emotional co-pilot increases dramatically.
And yet, we can't ignore the universal human mating preferences. The data is clear that women universally prefer older, socially established men who possess culturally important resources. Whether that historically meant owning fertile land or a large herd of cows, or today means a high income and social status.
So the mix of preferred traits varies, but the importance of being culturally successful by whatever metric that society values, that remains constant.
It does. It becomes a very complex trade-off puzzle. The perfect mate, wealthy, high status, handsome, and emotionally cooperative, is extremely rare. In the old model, you might trade down on looks or personality to secure financial stability. In the new model, if stability is guaranteed by external forces, you can afford to trade down on resource capacity to maximize for attraction, chemistry, or companionship.
So this complex combination, the structural obsolescence of the pure provider role, coupled with this biological mechanism shifting focus to genuine, non-negotiable desire, that creates the crisis that fuels the third and, I guess, the most reactive element of our deep dive, the ideological response we find in the digital world. Which brings us to the digital reckoning. This is where we analyze the socio-cultural factors and the community dynamics contributing to the proliferation of the red pill and manosphere ideologies. We have to examine their specific critiques of contemporary gender relations, the crisis of male identity they address, and then their proposed strategies for navigating this new sexual marketplace.
The Manosphere is really an umbrella term. It's for a collection of anti-feminist online communities, and it spans multiple ideologies, everything from men's rights activism and pickup artistry to more radical elements found in certain corners of the internet.
And the foundational metaphor is taken directly from the movie The Matrix, right? The idea of taking the red pill.
Yes. Taking the red pill means becoming enlightened to what they call life's ugly truths. It means seeing the underlying system of widespread exploitation of men that they believe is concealed by the matrix of conventional societal norms and beliefs.
How do they connect that to the movie's plot?
They argue the film's premise of autonomous machines feeding parasitically on human energy is a perfect mirror for men's exploitation by women. And this exploitation is masked by society's virtual reality, which they say is perpetuated by mainstream media and institutions like academia.
And central to their worldview is their definition of the operative illusion within this matrix. What is that exactly?
That illusion, in their framework, is the myth of female oppression. They fundamentally redefined feminism. They don't see it as a movement for equality, but as a collective female sexual strategy.
A strategy for what?
A strategy designed to maximize their position, to select mates, to switch mates, to locate the best genetic material, and to garner the maximum individual resources, all while maintaining what they would call plausible deniability.
So the red pill is positioned as the corrective antidote to that. It's men's own pragmatic counter-strategy. It seeks to uncover and use what they believe are the unchanging biological rules of human nature.
Right. Rules, they claim, that conventional society and liberal discourse actively deny in favor of, pleasant illusions. They often frame their perspective as a choice between scientific pragmatism and liberal idealism.
How so?
They insist the red pill is about pragmatism and truth based on observation. It's focused only on what works based on replicable results and sexual success. And they position themselves in direct opposition to fields like gender studies, which they tend to dismiss as value-laden and opinion-based.
This extremely reductionist, almost quasi-positivist approach, it naturally leads them to apply a very cynical market logic to human relationships.
It does. And that is the logic of the sexual marketplace.
Tell me about that.
One of the clearest expressions of this is found in the foundational documents of the largest red pill communities. They explicitly apply neoliberal economic ideology and rational actor theory to sexual relationships. They view all heterosexual interaction as a marketplace of supply and demand for sex.
Where women are designated as the sellers of sex.
Correct. And men are the buyers, exchanging other resources, money, status, commitment, for sexual access.
And the currency of this marketplace is sexual market value, or SMV.
Yes, and it's defined as a quantifiable currency. They argue that qualitative traits like personality or even financial success only matter insofar as they contribute to one's measurable quantitative SMV score. It reduces a person to a set of measurable, exchangeable commodities in a transaction.
And this commercial view of humanity leads to a strikingly grim futurist prediction they have.
It does. It connects right back to that idea of obsolescence we started with. If women are fundamentally commodities, then technological advancements, things like sex robots, hyper-realistic VR, specialized artificial intelligence, will logically cause a cataclysmic sexual devaluation of the woman as commodity.
So they see technology as the ultimate market disruptor that will finally break what they see as female sexual leverage.
That's the idea. But the critical question for us is, what psychologically pushes men toward embracing such an extreme, cynical, and fundamentally isolating worldview?
Right. What's the pathway?
Well, research has established a pretty robust link between specific male identity factors and the endorsement of these manosphere ideologies in the general population. And the core driver is linked to status threat and the acknowledgement of systemic privilege.
That sounds counterintuitive. Tell us more about that linkage.
It is, but it's compelling. The less that men acknowledge their privileged status relative to women in society, the more intensely they feel threatened by feminist challenges to the status quo. And this feeling of threat is the strongest predictor of a higher endorsement of manosphere attitudes, including anti-feminist views and these evolutionary beliefs about women's supposed manipulative and utilitarian nature.
So the narrative itself serves as a kind of psychological shield.
Exactly. Narratives within the manosphere, like the acronym AWALT, which stands for All Women Are Like That, they function to externalize blame. By assigning women a universally manipulative nature and then blaming feminism for creating a hostile market, men can avoid the painful need to acknowledge any societal privilege they might hold, a privilege they perceive as threatening to their male social identity.
Which suggests that the manosphere isn't just a guide to getting dates, it's a guide to managing a perceived identity oppression.
It is an explanation framework, first and foremost. This endorsement is strongest among men who have a high male social identification and who perceive gender status dynamics as unstable. If you highly identify with your gender, any challenge to the traditional male role, like the dismantling of the provider contract, is interpreted as a personal threat. And that evokes backlash and the adoption of these extreme counter-narratives.
Okay, so given that psychological foundation, what practical strategy or praxis does the red pill prescribe for men who feel exploited and threatened?
It promotes an intensely applied, individualistic form of evolutionary psychology that's aimed at achieving personal sexual success. The strategy is all about seizing agency back from the external system and placing it firmly on the self.
What does that look like in practice?
It involves rigorous self-improvement, improving your physique, your behavior, high-value skills, and building what they call game and, crucially, walk-away power.
That walk-away power is the direct antidote to David's position, isn't it? David was utterly dependent on the contract. He had no exit strategy whatsoever.
Walk-away power is the ultimate leverage in their view. It is a genuine indifference to loss that comes from having a rich, independent life outside of any single relationship. In this framework, you only truly own a relationship when you are emotionally and practically capable of leaving it without suffering a catastrophic loss of yourself or your resources.
And we see this aggressive shift in that anecdote of Alex, the recovering nice guy. He pivoted his entire strategy from his wallet to his self-respect.
Alex realized he was seeking validation by purchasing convenience and stability. The red pill strategy prescribed a necessary, cynical, emotional denial. The idea is that you must mature beyond that want for an idealized, unconditional love.
What does that mean, to mature beyond that?
It means ignoring one's own feelings of altruism and actively overriding women's emotional cues. For example, remaining firm and ignoring tears, which they are taught to interpret as manipulative tests of a man's resolve.
So this emotional denial isn't seen as repression, but as a necessary survival mechanism.
Absolutely. They argue this stoicism is required because men's deeply felt needs for intersubjective connection, for a truly reciprocal, unconditional emotional bond, will never be met by inherently Machiavellian women. That's the belief, because of the fixed biological algorithm they think governs female behavior.
The argument being that the male, unconditional concept of love is fundamentally rebuked by women's more fluid and utilitarian concept of love, which they say is driven by hypergamy and current benefit. And that framing justifies their adoption of a highly transactional Machiavellian approach to intimacy.
Yes. Viewing the pursuit of connection as a battlefield rather than a partnership. It's a mechanism for men to protect themselves from the pain of obsolescence, the pain of realizing that past investment no longer secures present desire. By adopting the red pill framework, they can redefine their failure as an external, systemic truth rather than a personal shortcoming, and then arm themselves with strategies to succeed on this newly defined sexual battleground.
So we've established 3 massive interwoven forces that have nullified that traditional provider contract that David was operating under. Let's try to bring this all back together for a final synthesis.
The erosion really began at the structural level. The state and its legal structures, primarily through unilateral divorce and enhanced safety nets, absorbed the function of survival provision. This legal and economic shift systematically devalued the average man's resource offering in the marketplace.
Right. And that resource obsolescence then allowed the older, deeper evolutionary mechanisms to take control of mate choice. Briffault's law dictated that in the absence of necessity, selection criteria shifted dramatically, moving the emphasis away from stable provision and towards genetic quality, status, and emotional value.
And in affluent societies, with that survival baseline met by the state, the search optimized for non-negotiable desire and excitement. It could, because the cost of prioritizing those traits, a lack of food or shelter, had been subsidized away.
And finally, the resulting crisis in male identity and status that fueled the rise of this digital ideology, the red pill. This movement provided men with a cohesive, pragmatic strategy based on market logic, absolute personal agency, and a deliberate strategic denial of emotional vulnerability.
And all of that is framed as a rational response to a hostile reality.
So the age of the pure beta bucks provider is definitively over.
It's over. And it was made obsolete not by the whims of individual women, but by the systemic efficiency of the state as the ultimate provider of economic and legal security. Briffault's law now operates in its pure, unforgiving form because the biological consequences of shifting your mating strategy are no longer fatal.
Which means the choice for the modern man is now stark. He can continue to offer a depreciated currency money and stability in a market that no longer requires it or particularly wants it for its own sake, or he has to forge a new value proposition, and that new value proposition must be centered entirely on the self-improving genuine status, establishing unwavering self-respect and building that walk-away power, which seems to be the only true foundation upon which non-negotiable, non-transactional desire can ever be built.